little bit different, a little bit different focus, but still, we're going to see some stuff in here that's actually going to, pertain to Christ. And there's some references in this chapter that, if we look into the New Testament, we're going to see that these are actually referenced in the New Testament, where Zechariah is quoted almost verbatim by the apostles and Christ's disciples. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we come thanking Thee for the night of rest, and thanking Thee, Father, for this opportunity that we have gathered together and study the Your Word. In Your day, that is the grace and bread of life unto us. May we help Him, Father, to be studied. May we be receptive to what we learn, how it pertains to our lives today, and what it shows us to do. Lead us now as we go through this class. Thank You for Your Son Jesus, through His death, His effort, and His Son.
So, like the Revelation in chapter 9, this chapter also has a kind of a near component and a far component. And the near is kind of talking about the revival of Israel's power, and it's actually kind of in the future. I think there's some references here to the Maccabees in the 2nd century, which there's not a lot in the Bible about that. But if you look at it from a historical standpoint, that is an important part of history. And then looking even forward to the reign and the return of Jesus, the Messiah. So chapter 9 kind of presents the victory of God's people from a positive side for the most part, showing how the true Israel shall be made strong by the Lord and shall prevail. And I think we always need to keep in mind that it's not just God doing this. The children of Israel has their part also. They have to do their part for this to happen. God is always going to do His part. And if we follow what He says and do our part, then we're always going to have a good outcome. So without abandoning this point of view, the chapter 10 brings a greater emphasis to bear upon the negative side of the victory, namely how the enemies shall be brought low, yet particular stress is at the same time laid upon the gathering of the scattered Israelites, which is kind of happening here at the same time. So let's start with verse 1. It says, "Ask rain from Jehovah in the time of the latter rain. Jehovah shall make storm clouds, and He gives them showers of rain, grass to everyone in the field." Now, that's the translation from the modern King James Version. And there's several other translations that talk about the storm clouds. In the American Standard Version, it says, "Ask ye of Jehovah rain in the time of the latter rain, even of Jehovah that maketh lightning." And it talks about lightning rather than the storm clouds. And then in the King James Version, it talks about make bright clouds. Now, the bright clouds, if you look at the original text, the word used there is a reference to lightning. And if you think about it, when we have a storm, the clouds seem to light up and be bright even though they're dark because of the lightning. So we're basically talking about a storm here that's going to happen. And if you'll remember back from chapter 9, God was withholding the rain, and this was kind of a period of drought. So Zechariah here is giving them kind of a key here to God is going to be in control of this, and when it comes, there's not going to be any doubt of who's in charge and what type of rain that it's going to be. It talks here about showers of rain, and in the original text, the word literally means a rain of heavy rain. So in other words, we're not just talking about a sprinkle, we're talking about a storm that's going to bring down, a heavy rain, and a downpour, which I think everybody around here is familiar with, how the rain can come down sometimes so hard that you can't hardly see across the street. So this is a similar type of wording that was used in Job 37:6, but kind of in an inverted order. It also talks here about the grass, and this is kind of a general term that would include, the corn, the grain, all the things that man is going to need to prosper. There's going to be food for man to eat. There's going to be grass for the cattle to eat. So this is going to be a shower that's going to kind of revive everything that's going on here in this particular time. Now we see here that the Lord has urged his people in the day of blessing he just described to ask him to send rain. And it's not just that they need to see the dependence that they have on God and ask God for these things. And God is in complete control, but he wants his people to recognize that, and the way that, of course, that they're recognizing it is by asking for something to happen. Just like we pray and we make our petitions to God through Jesus, that if we desire to have something, then we make that petition to God, and in his infinite wisdom and will, he will grant what we need. And we've talked many times whether we need it or not sometimes, and we don't always get what we want, but we always seem to get from what God is what is actually best for us in the long run. So this is kind of a wake up call to these people, and he's it's only reasonable that that they do this to get these things. He's not asking anything unreasonable. He is asking something that's actually pretty easy to do. It's pretty easy to ask. Now if you look at the social situation here, the Canaanites, they gave all their credit for the things that happened to Baal. And he was the one, according to them, that would send the rain, produce the fertility. But, we all know that God is the true rainmaker, and that Baal was a false god. And any time that they asked something that, and gave a credit to Baal, was just, a lucky deal that they asked, at the same time that God was going to grant something. Baal had no power over the elements. And since rain is often the symbol of many types of blessings in the Old Testament, spiritual as well as physical blessings is probably in view here. And there's a lot of references that you can see in a similar type of situation. Now, a lot of the commentators include this verse back in the 9th chapter, in the 11 to 17, because of the continuation of the thought. But the reference here is to rain in due season, rain when it's supposed to impregnate the seeds that were sown and to fill the ear near the time of harvest. Because if you can have an ear of corn, but if there's not enough rain out there, it's going to be a pretty scraggly ear of corn. The moisture out of the ground is what makes the corn really good. And, even in a drought, you can get ears of corn, but it's not fit to eat because it's just low. Even the deers won't eat it. So, because it's kind of a scraggly deal. So, the importance of rain here is really being talked about, because these people depended greatly on the harvest. They didn't have a grocery store to go to and bring it in from some other part of the world. What they had is what they were able to grow there. So this was a very important message that these people had. Now, the time of the rain in that particular part of the world is a little bit earlier. That February and March is kind of the time that we're talking about here, not necessarily the spring that we kind of think about. So the first rain kind of gets the the crop growing, and then the latter rain is the one that kind of, you know, makes everything grow, you know, really good and have a really, you know, a really good harvest. So we're talking here about not only spiritual blessings, but we're also talking about temporal blessings at this point also. And through God has begun to bless us as we are not to, you know, relax our prayers. You know, once we get what we want, we just don't say, well, that's the end of it. You know, we'll see you the next time. The prayer needs to be continual. Bill, you got something to say?
I'll say this at the second verse also gives us some real foreshadowing of the early time of the church, because it talks about the rain falling and benefiting everyone, not just certain people. And that certainly with the timing, obviously, the gospel being extended to the Gentiles. So everyone's going to get the benefits of God's blessing.
Yeah, I found a really good quote in one of the, and I can't remember which one of the commentators said this, but I think it's a good quote. It says, "The spirit of prayer in the church is an index at once of her piety and of the spiritual blessings she may expect from God." And, you know, we talk a lot here about, you know, the power of prayer and the importance of prayer and praying continually to, you know, to God for blessings and the strength that, you know, that prayer brings. So when the church is full of prayer, God pulls out his, you know, his fullest blessings. So I think that, you know, that's the, you know, the very importance of prayer here. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 2. "For the family idols speak iniquity, and the diviners have seen a lie and have told false dreams. They comfort in vain, therefore they wander like a flock. They were troubled because there was no shepherd." So in contrast to the true and only God, you know, and the idol here that's being referenced, the scholar seems to think is Teraphim. And it was kind of like a household god for, you know, for the people there, and that was the one that the Canaanites were, you know, were looking to, and the point here is, you know, that this god that was there, it only led to iniquity and diviners that were misleading people with these visions that they were supposed to be, you know, that they were supposed to be having. This is talked a lot about in Deuteronomy and Jeremiah also. And, you know, the comfort that these false gods were basically worthless. And there's no real comfort there at all. Consequently, the people who rely on these false indicators of God's will, they kind of wander around like sheep in the wilderness without any type of leader, you know, leading them, and the experience, they're going to have a lot of needless trouble because of because of this. Now Mark in his writings, Mark 16:34, he says, "And going out, Jesus saw a large crowd, and he was moved with the compassion toward them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things." So, you know, Jesus recognized that without God and without the directions that God give, people are just going to wander around, and there wasn't going to be any real direction in their life. And this is spoken of the Jews, and it has to refer to their adulterous practices, you know, before the captivity, and that's what got them in trouble. Is when they moved away from God and started going to these idols, that's what got them into the trouble, because these were not the type of examples that, you know, God wanted his people to have. So as a result of that, they became a flock that really didn't have a shepherd, because they had a false God that was, you know, that was leading them, and they just kind of moved around from place to place. They wandered in the wilderness, you know, and they were looking for something, but they weren't able to find it, because the thing that they were looking for, they were looking in the wrong direction. You know, they were looking toward these idols and not looking toward God.
They actually would have these cherubim in the home. They were very common. For some reason, they were like that.
Like a little shrine.
They were like a little shrine, exactly. And so you were worshiping a false god. That was your daily reminder in your home what you worship.
And, you know, and people still have that today. They have, one of my neighbors, when I lived at Mom and Dad's house, people across the street, they went to the Greek Orthodox Church, and they had a little shrine there in their house, and every day when they went and did their prayers, they would go to that little shrine that they had, and they would pray to whoever they were praying to. I can't remember if it was Mother Mary or who it was. I think it was Mother Mary, the I don't know, anyway, whatever that little figure was, that, you know, but that's what they prayed to. I mean, that was basically useless. So, you know, the sheep wander around, and what happens is they get themselves into trouble, and if you have a flock of sheep that's just running around, what's going to happen to them? There's going to be some type of prey. They're going to become prey to some type of wild animal, because there isn't anybody, you know, there isn't anybody watching them. And in this case, you know, the children of Israel were getting themselves in trouble, and they were driving themselves further away from, you know, from God, because they weren't looking to God, and God was not their true shepherd. They were following these false prophets who they trusted, but they weren't shepherds. They just, you know, they were like wolves ready to devour them. Ezra talks about this in Ezra 34 and 5. He says, "And they were scattered for lack of a shepherd, and they became food to all the beasts of the field when they were scattered." So they were just out there, you know, pretty much exposed and vulnerable to any doctrine that would come along, and every time they would go into this, they would go a little bit further away from God. And now they were scattered, and while they didn't know the Messiah as their shepherd, and this kind of, you know, typified also, you know, the state of the disciples when they had forsaken Jesus and fled. You know, we read here in Matthew 26 and 56, "But all of it happened that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples fled, you know, forsaking him." They, you know, this is kind of a reference back to, you know, to what we're reading here in Zechariah. And then moving on to the 13th chapter, Zechariah says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man who is my companion, says Jehovah of hosts, strike the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn my hand on the little ones." You know, this is a reference to Jesus, and this is a reference here to what happened when Jesus was taken into custody and crucified. All the disciples, they went away. You know, they scattered. And, you know, this, you know, kind of a foretelling of what we read here in Matthew 26 and 56. Now, there are some that think that the idols and diviners were those of some of the secularized Greeks who excited their masters with promises of success against the Maccabees. Again, kind of, you know, looking forward a little bit. And, you know, these Greeks would pump these people up with all these wild stories and fables, and, you know, just tell them all the success that they were going to have, and all of a sudden they didn't have this success. They were defeated, and you know, again showing that, you know, they had no power. Now there's others that think that this is kind of a reference to the Babylonian captivity that's kind of foretold, and it talks a little bit about future events of the as though it was prophets of the past. So, you know, the modern parallel here is kind of the renewed interest in magic and spiritualism, and, you know, and all of these miracles and stuff that you see on TV. You know, this is not something that was just going on in this time. It goes on today. You know, there's a long list of faith healers and people that you know, supposedly can do miracles and to, you know, to show the things that they have. But, you know, it's like they say, take them to the graveyard, take them to the grave and say, okay, make this one raise. That, you know, that's kind of, but, you know, there's people that believe that, and it's a sad state of affairs that, you know, that people are deceived by people who you know, do that type of thing. So the more widespread modern equivalent is to ignore God altogether and to assume that there's no problem that's not beyond man's unaided power to solve. You know, sometimes we have a tendency to think that, you know, there's no problem that we can't figure out ourselves, but obviously there's, you know, without God's power, none of these things would happen. But there's people out there that they don't think that they need God and that they can handle everything themselves. But it's kind of like, I was watching Jeopardy, and one of the clues was talking about, you know, there's no atheists in foxholes. And you know, it's kind of the same. They don't go to God until it's beyond their power to, you know, to take care of it. Comments about that verse. All right, let's move on to verse 3. My anger was kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the he-goats, for Jehovah of hosts has visited his flock the house of Judah, and has made them as his beautiful horse in battle. So, you know, the Lord God is angry against these false prophets, these false shepherds, the rulers, the kings, all these priests and prophets that are speaking against, you know, the will of God. And, you know, he's mad because these people have led his people astray like rams. And this is a common type of analogy that's made in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel 28, 3 through 7, 1 Kings 16 and 31, and 22, chapter 22, 6 through 12, and 2 Kings 1 and 2, 16 and 15, and 21 and 6. So the shepherd and the rams may include the foreign rulers under which the Jews, you know, had to live. And of course they got themselves into that situation. Now, the Lord is going to visit his flock, namely the house of Judah, which is the Israelites, and he would make his people like the majestic war horse that he rode into battle to defeat his enemies. So this is foretelling of the resurgence of the children of Israel against these people. So in other words, he was going to empower the Israelites, and the weak sheep would become as strong as the horses. He was going to strengthen his people, and some of the ones who were the weakest were going to become the strongest. And you know, we can see in all the way through the Old Testament where somebody was put in a situation where if you were picking, you probably wouldn't pick them to go do something, but God picked them, gave them the power to do it. And probably the most classic example of that is David. You know, if you were going to pick a warrior to go to battle, he's probably not the one that you'd pick, because, you know, he was a young man and really didn't have a lot of warrior attributes, but God picked him, and he followed what God said, and he became a great warrior, and he became a great king, and had a good, even though he made a lot of mistakes, he was still had a good, you know, reputation with God. Now, in Zechariah 9 and 13, the horses were represented under the image of bows and arrows, and here, under their commander-in-chief of Jehovah, it's talked about as being a battle horse. Now, God can make his people timid through, they could be as sheep, or they could be as courageous as a charger or a battle horse is talking about here. Now, the general rode on the most beautiful and richly comprised horse that tended that with the greatest care. And if you think about that, you know, when you study history, a lot of these famous generals, their horse was just as famous as they were, and of course, obviously, they got great care. So Jehovah might cast off the Jews for their vileness, but he regards his election or adoption of them whence he calls them his flock, and therefore he's going to save them. Even though they wander away from him, and even though they do a lot of things against what he wants them to do, they're still his flock. It's just like your kids. When they go out and they mess something up, you know, they can mess it up really good, but they're still your kids, you know, and you still love them. So that, you know, it's the same deal here with God. Even though these Israelites have gone out there and messed up a gob of times, God still loved him, and he still considered him, to be his people, and he was going to save them in the end. Comments about that verse?
We see over connected business, I think it's in Luke is where Jesus says, I am the great shepherd, and my sheep hear my voice,
Right,
and they follow me.
right,
So go back to this, he is our shepherd today.
right.
We have to obey what he says.
And eventually, these people heard the voice again too. It just took them a little while to get the message. All right, let's move on to verse 4. Out of him came the cornerstone, out of him the nail, out of him the battle bow, out of him every oppressor together. So from the house of Judah will come the cornerstone of the building, which is the kingdom, and he would build and namely the Messiah. And there are lots of references in the Old Testament and in the New Testament about Jesus being the cornerstone. So starting with Isaiah 28:16, therefore so say the Lord Jehovah, behold, I place in Zion a stone for a foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation, he who believes shall not hurry. That's an obvious reference to Jesus. In Acts 4:11, it says this is the stone which you builders have counted worthless, and he has become the head of the corner. That's a reference to, they're talking about Jesus. And in Ephesians 2:19 and 20, it says, now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. And then Peter writes in 1 Peter 2:6, therefore also is contained the scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect precious, and he who believes him shall never be ashamed. Peter there is referencing what we're just talking about here in Zechariah. Now, the cornerstone in the Hebrew, it's Pina, was the figure of a leader who would stabilize a nation and keep them from sliding down a slippery slope. When you're building a house and you put the foundation down, if you don't get the cornerstone right, get it square, get it plumbed and all that, then the building is not going to be the way that it needs to be. And that's why so much care is taken about laying the first stone or the cornerstone to make sure that the building is built properly. Now we also see the reference here to the Messiah would also be kind of like a tent peg. Now the word in the original text was yadet, Y-A-T-H-E-D, which is Hebrew for nail. And this would hold the tent or the kingdom, firmly in place. It's like a tent peg. You put the tent pegs in, you tie off the tent, and those pegs are the things that keeps the tent from blowing away in a storm or just flat falling in on you. Now this is kind of a reference to a large peg that was inside these Oriental tents, and on which they would hang the most valuable furniture, and it was like the cornerstone of a tent. Of course, a tent is a movable object, but this is a very important part of the tent. And on the Messiah hung all the glory and the hope of his people. Now, the Hebrew word also describes a peg inside the tent, which the people hung, their beautiful things that glorified their home. It's kind of like a centerpiece of their house. The nail here is an emblem of a fixedness in itself. You drive in a nail and it fastens something securely in place. And this is kind of a reference to the security that's going to be given to the children of Israel as long as they are dependent on God to do the things that they should. Isaiah in his writing says, and they shall hang upon him all the glory of his father's house. the offspring and the issue from the vessels of cups to the vessels of flagelings. And this is Isaiah 22 and 24. So, this is not an unknown concept for for these people about this nail. When Zechariah was talking about this nail, this was something that that they understood. Now we know that Christ is the cornerstone, and Christ is the nail that's fixed, that's fixed to the wall whereby the vessels are supported. And the word of Christ is the bow from which the arrows rend the king's enemies. And, the bow is a reference to battle, and the reference is that Christ will destroy his enemies in battle. And I think this is really comes out in the Revelation chapter 19 verses 11 through 16, where it talks about the final enemy will be death, and death will be destroyed. So all of these figures here in this picture show a strong, stable, victorious, and trustworthy nature of Christ and his rule. And this is foretelling of the Messiah coming and the Messiah ruling. And this verse constitutes one of the most far-reaching and meaningful Masonic prophecies in the Old Testament, in which the Shir summarizes a number of declarations by the former prophets, mostly Isaiah, and kind of sets forth the character and the ministry of Israel's Redeemer and the Messiah. You could take this verse and sum up, the things that Jesus had, that Jesus did on his ministry and still does for us today. So the house of Judah would also, go forth, and they would overcome every oppressing ruler. And the Messiah intervenes in the manner to be noted, and every oppressor will depart Judah, and cause the effects, will clearly be seen. God's people were going to overcome all the obstacles that that they were going to come into in the land there, as long as they did what God told them to do. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 5. And they shall be like mighty ones who trampled the mud of the streets in the battle, and they shall fight because Jehovah is with them, and they shall make the riders on horses ashamed. So the Israelites, they're going to kind of change from being sheeps to they're going to become mighty men in battle. And of course, we talked a little bit about David being a mighty man. And I think that if you look at the history in general, the Maccabees and their successors, they were mighty warriors also. And because they had God behind them and they were doing what God told them to do, he was giving them the strength to do what needed to be done. They were going to subdue the Lord's enemies in battle, and they were going to do that because God was with them. And we as we have studied in the Old Testament, every time that the children of Israel did what God told them to do, they were victorious. When they deviated from God's plan, it led to disaster. And it's kind of true today. When we deviate from God's plan, it's not going to end well. And that's why it's important that we stay the course and follow the things that that the Bible tells us to do. So the oppressing adversaries will be defeated and shamed, even though they fought from a position of strength. You think about Joshua leading the children of Israel against all the people to clear out the promised land. They were underdogs in every situation, but yet they because God was on their side, they ended up having the position of strength, and they won. Now the Macedonians who opposed the Maccabees had a much larger cavalry, and the Jews didn't have any at all. And they really didn't have that many weapons, but yet they overcame the horsemen. And we don't talk a lot about cavalry today because we've got tanks. But in that day and time, the cavalry was the tank of the time. And it's very hard, you know, if you think about it, for a person to go up against a tank, you're usually a little bit behind. But, you know, in this situation, you know, God was with the children of Israel, and they were able to, you know, to overcome a far superior force, and, you know, pretty much wear out the enemy's horsemen, which was a pretty good feat back in that day. Now, the Jews were forbidden by law to multiply horses in battle, and this goes back to Deuteronomy 17 and 16, and they are made Jehovah's war horse. And this, you know, obviously the people are not going to turn into horses, but it's an allusion here to, you know, the strength and the power that the Jews are going to have, that they're going to be able to take on, you know, these superior forces and basically beat them down. And they were going to be, as it were, God's cavalry. Now the cavalry was the chief strength of the Sino-Grecian army. And if you read in the history and you read First Maccabees 3 and 39, it kind of talks about this. Now, this is also referenced in the Psalms 20 and 7. It says, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of Jehovah our God." So, you know, this is kind of a reference. You know, they were trusting in their might of their army, but the Jews were trusting in the power of God to overcome. So the Lord's infantry is going to defeat the world's, you know, most superior armies, because the Lord is with them. And it's a great mistake to suppose that all that will be accomplished by, you know, Jehovah's single hand. God does his part. We have to do our part in the deal to make this a successful operation. Comments about that verse? How much time we got, Keith? 1 minute. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll save that 1 minute for next week. So we'll pick up next week with the 6th verse. Appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.